the workshop. So I think we all agree that it's kind of crazy times, right? Like every day you see an archive paper and all the videos out there that solve these incredible tasks. And many of them actually also seem to work in the real world, right? Like, and that's one of the big steps forward. Um, and one of the things that often happens to me is that I just don't have a good sense for how well this stuff now really works. How broadly is it applicable, right? Even if it's, for example, demonstrated on a real robot, it sometimes might be very much overfitting to the kind of demonstration data that was given in the paper. And it's just difficult to get a good assessment for how broad these tools are. But at the same time, I think we also all agree it's pretty amazing what's going on, right? And we'll see huge progress in this whole area. But that brought back also this notion to me, like, okay, how could we maybe benchmark techniques, right? And how can we make it a bit more comparable, things like that, with research groups. So I think on the one hand side, you might agree that benchmarking would be good, right? We can measure things against each other. We can see how we're really making quantitative progress on certain tasks. Now we also know, of course, that it's really hard to benchmark real robot systems, and it's just because it's not just a data set, right? It's a real interactive setting in which you have to test these robots, and you need to, first of all, you need to have robots, and you also need to scale these benchmarks and the environment settings so that your very difficult to do in the real world, which, as a caveat, and we can discuss all of this, of course, in the panel, and doesn't mean we shouldn't do it in the real world. There's many tasks that we have that we can only benchmark in the real world because we just don't have the simulators for it. But I think there are at least certain aspects of where simulation, I hope, can help even for benchmarking. The advantage of simulation, of course, for this kind of task is that you have a very clear control over the setting, right? You know, for example, assets, scenes, tasks. So it makes it much more reproducible than, for example, in the real world because of this control. You can also, of course, scale things, right? You can have many different assets on which you can test something. You can randomly generate environments. And of course, moving towards what we see now going on with VLMs and LLMs, of course, nowadays, we can start generating assets, environments, tasks, and even solution examples all in using LLMs, right? It's kind of, I'm sure you're following all this, it's pretty crazy what's going on, right? That now we can actually generate all these simulation aspects using or leveraging LLMs in some form or another in broader settings. At the same time, of course, it's not easy to get simulation to actually work well enough, especially for the purpose of benchmarking, just because the physics interaction and all of this is pretty tricky, and the assets have to have a certain quality, and then also kind of what is the quality of the sensor simulation, be it depth cameras, color cameras, or even force torque sensing, things like that. It's still not trivial, I would say. So if we look at what's going on here in the community, especially with embodied AI, there's many benchmarks out there, right? And they are often designed so that you can compare different learning techniques against each other. Various of them abstract away even the low-level physics. So the question then might be, how well does that transfer to the real world? There's some environments and simulators out there that focus much more on the physics simulation aspects as well. And at this point, it seems like the gold standard of what you can say about your simulator is something related to sim-to-real, right? Like where you say, if I can somehow train my robot in this simulation environment, and if it then also works in the real world, then that's kind of almost the best we can do, if you like it, right? And especially with respect to these environments, I don't think anybody is really thinking beyond sim-to-real towards, let's say, real-world benchmarking. Okay. So now let me go back to this, what we actually would like to have from a kind of a simulation benchmark. with a focus on that it should be able to tell us something about the performance in the real world. So on the one hand side, we have sim to real, which is of course, I think already a good sign, right? If you can train a policy or perception system in simulation so that it then works in the real world, that's already a very good sign, right? But at the same time, there are certain risks associated with it because your simulator might actually not be that great. And all you do is you just add a huge amount of randomization to this whole thing, and then train a policy so that it transfers to the real world, right? So you just randomize enough such that the real world distribution is somehow captured by your distribution that you have in your simulation environment. And that might work in certain aspects, but at the same time, you might actually make it harder on the policy learning that it actually has to be. Right? So what we'd like to have is something like we want to be able to compare algorithms against each other, right? And the important part here is, especially with respect to the topic of the workshop with deployable robots, right, is that somehow we want the comparison between two algorithms in simulation to result in the same kind of ranking and comparison that you would see in the real world, right? Because otherwise, all you do is you're kind of comparing policy learning algorithms, but you can't say anything about whether these relationships or what it means for the real world. So that's what we would like to have. And you could even go one level further, which I think is even harder, is you might want to be able to use a simulation benchmark in order to predict outcomes in the real world, which means that you want to be able to say, well, based on that benchmark here, my robot is going to succeed in the world, whatever, 95% of the time or something like that, right? And that's actually, I think, as various of you might agree, it's very difficult, right? Like to get actual performance measures out of simulation benchmark, especially in the kind of settings we talk about here, okay? So from that aspect, if you want to get to that level where you can compare things and then it transfers to the real world, I think the notion of sim to real is just not enough, because often when we look at the details of these simulators, is that some details don't really match the real world really well. And for instance, even if you do training of like picking up objects, sometimes if your assets aren't modeled accurately enough or your friction parameters aren't set correctly enough, then suddenly your simulator might actually behave in a way that, first of all, is not really realistic. And we often feel like picking up things in simulation might be harder than in the real world, right? And that is not what we need. So therefore, sim to real is not enough. Now, what we would like to have is something that I might call, in addition to sim to real, we also want to have not sim to not real, meaning if it really doesn't work in simulation, then you want to be sure that it's also not going to work in the real world, meaning that simulation shouldn't actually be harder than the real world, and it should actually match very well what you want to have. I could also have called that contrapositive real to sim, but real to sim is kind of taken by the notion of just kind of getting the real world as assets in your simulator. But I think about it more like on a behavior level, right? So that you can really say, if you have an algorithm that works in the real world, that algorithm should also work actually in the simulator, right? Which means the simulator should capture all the properties of the real world very well. So what I want to do in this talk is kind of go through some of the aspects of manipulation tasks that we've been looking at recently from a simulation aspect, but especially kind of focusing on these notions of kind of, and I'm sure we can talk about that at the panel, how good my intuition is here, but how close we are to being able to use them for some kind of benchmarking, right? And the first one is, oh, and by the way, yeah, I want to also mention here, of course, all of this also depends on, for example, what sensor modality you're using, right? So my sense is, for example, depth camera sensing transfers better to between sim and real. RGB sensing transfers actually reasonably well from sim to real, because you just add crazy amounts of randomization, and then your network is going to learn something that works actually reasonably well in the real world as well. But because you need all that randomization, that doesn't mean that it's actually reflecting the real data that you're going to see. And then also where we still lacking, I think, if we think about the more industrial tasks. I think Stefan talked about it this morning. The force torque sensing and touch sensing is just something that we start seeing more and more, but it's not solved. But the first, okay, great. All right, so here's the things I'm gonna talk about, right? The first one is just motion generation, right? Which seems like the simplest task, and that I'm sure most learning people would say, that's too boring for me to work on. But it actually turns out that it's a topic that people have been working on for decades. And it seems like something that we should be able to benchmark really, really well, right? Because the task is just like you generate a simulated environment and you say, I would like to generate a path, a trajectory for my manipulator to get from one location to the other, collision free. And then there are certain measures you might want to put in. How do you evaluate different techniques against each other? But it turns out there's also that the community, they haven't even really developed many benchmarks that you can really use. So there's some effort going on that Lydia Kavrakis' lab developed, kind of a system that enables people to set up benchmarks, but it's not quite, I think, at the level that we want to have, where you can generate many different environments and many different tasks. And also many of these benchmarks or tests that people are using are making assumptions that are maybe not really realistic for a robot that you deploy in the real world. So they might assume that you have perfect models of all the assets in the environment, which, as we know, is not going to work in the real world, right? So I think if we want to do benchmarking in this domain, we need to benchmark it from the incorporating perception as well. So, for example, the robot doesn't have access to the whole environment, but it might have only access to, for example, a point cloud observed with a depth camera or something like that. Just as a note, this was a call paper last year, work that my student Adam did on motion policy network, where what we did was we just generated some million motion trajectories for these tasks, right, where we randomly move assets around and generate kind of different versions of these cabinets and cubbies and things like that, and then train a network that just takes as input a point cloud and then generates a policy. And the advantage is it actually worked pretty well in the real world. Here on the right, you can see that. But also just to highlight, kind of the reviewers were all over the place. So one reviewer said, oh, I love it. This is tested exactly the way I would like it to be tested. And another reviewer said, like, oh, I have no idea if this is even a hard task, right? And how does it compare to other things? And it was really hard to get this work kind of, I think, first in this line of work, even get it published, because reviewers often complain, like, oh, you don't compare it to this or you don't compare it to that. And I think that's an example of a domain where clearly benchmarking should be done, I think, even more thoroughly or more generally than we're seeing. So in that sense, starting to fill in some ideas here is, I think, for free space motion planning, even with depth camera data or something like that, my sense is sim2real works actually very well, and also even not sim2real, so it's kind of a really good reflection of the real world. I'm not talking about the lowest level policies here, right? It's more the trajectory generation where you use RT style versions with trajectory optimization afterwards. And I think also that this is ready for benchmarking, which means I think we should do more benchmarking in this domain and more environments. Now moving on to grasping objects. So we've done some work here on kind of generating large data sets where you feed in object models and then you use physics simulation to check out which of these grasps are going to work, which means you put the gripper at a random position and then you close it and you shake it and you check whether the object stays within the gripper, and you say if it stays within the gripper, then that's a valid grasp that should work. And that's, we have this acronym data set, and there's also now some more efforts out there, 1 billion grasp data sets where people can compare their techniques. And my sense is that actually, at least for depth cameras, that the results that you get from that training actually transfer pretty well to the real world. So this was immediately policy just trained from point clouds in simulation. It immediately works actually pretty well in the real world. Okay, so moving just beyond single object grasping, we've done some work. I don't go into all the details here, but for example, now we can also pick up objects, for example, that are like a bit more cluttered scene. We can also train the vision system to recognize these objects. And of course, nowadays with segment anything and progress in VLMs, of course, that's a topic that is addressed very well by the vision and language communities. Here there's a paper by Anthony, he's over there, where this is also a system that's purely trained in SIM, so we can kind of generate assets and generate kind of example demonstrations, and then use, in this case, for example, diffusion models in order to place these objects. So my sense is, in the area of, let's say, relatively free space, pick and place, I think we are doing pretty well, specifically on the sim to real. So all these systems, what you see here, is just trained in simulation. So now going back to my table here. So I think for this space that I just kind of illustrated, I think we're doing actually very well with respect to sim to real. Not sim to not real, I mean, I'm only giving a 1+ because, again, there are sometimes the assets just don't always work quite that well, right? Especially if you want to go to a system where you have like thousands and thousands of assets, right, the data sets, that if you look at the details, sometimes the physics parameters and stuff like that aren't quite set the right way, and then suddenly your simulator does crazy stuff and things like that. So, but I think we're pretty close in that domain, that actually the behavior in simulation matches the real world pretty well. Again, with the caveat, sometimes it's harder in sim, right? And that means with respect to benchmarking, for example, oh yeah, there's a discussion point. With respect to benchmarking, I think we should be able to benchmark these systems pretty well now in simulation. And by that, I mean, it's not only that you generate an environment and you train something in sim and you benchmark it in sim. What I mean is that we should be able soon to benchmark systems that are trained in the real world and developed in the real world, but use simulation to benchmark them, right? I think that's kind of a different aspect here. I think that would be good because we see so many systems out there right now that are geared towards real world deployment that we still want to be able to benchmark them in simulation, okay? But I wouldn't trust them. So I think for algorithm comparison, I think we should be doing pretty well. Absolute measures, I don't think we're quite there yet, where you can really say, okay, based on that test in this environment, I can guarantee that it's going to work 95% of the time. I don't think we're quite there. Now going beyond just this kind of, let's say, reasonably simple pick and place, if we look at more context-rich tasks, what is becoming relevant, I'm sure Stefan mentioned some of these, like in industrial settings, right, where actually the spaces in which you have to insert things or you have to contact things are much tighter. The simulation turns out to be much harder. So in that space, we've done some work on that. You can see here the NIST board, and there's now newer versions with more complex objects and assemblies, but they developed that for real world benchmarking, right? And the question is now, could we go towards systems that we can do this kind of training and benchmarking in simulation? So we've developed this factory work last year, where now we can at least simulate these assets very well and very fast. We can now go also then train policies actually in simulation. And now, as of this year, we're also then been able to transfer them to the real world, which is kind of the sim to real aspect. So again, all these interactions, they're pretty tight margin, and I'm not saying they are working at the level that this is what you would put into your industrial setting, just because the success rate and speed isn't quite there yet. But at least it's an indication that we can now simulate those things well enough that we can do some form of sim to real. Okay. And we also can set up, then of course, that's a nice thing, we can set up these environments in which you can test, and if you want, also train your system. Okay. Another setting related to more complex tasks are these kind of more dynamic tasks. Here, for example, like also related to what like OpenAI did. There's some really good work Tolkien's team at MIT. It's about this reorientation kind of task with dexterous manipulation. And we're seeing some more things like twiddling things and stuff like that. But in that domain, I think we can say that Sim2Real works. Well, this is Sim2Real, so it obviously works in some form. At the same time, I wouldn't say it's perfectly solved, even Sim2Real, in the sense of give me any assets, we'll train it in simulation, and it's gonna work immediately in the real world or something like that. But we clearly have at least good indications that it's possible pretty well. At the same time, how much specifically would I trust that the simulation is behaving exactly the same way as the real world, which means more like the not sim to not real aspect? I don't think we're quite there yet, right? Which means that these tasks have maybe failure modes that don't reflect the kind of failure modes you would see in the real world, and the other way about. Okay. So in that sense, I would say for this domain where we're talking about the more tight interaction tasks and the dexterous manipulation kind of stuff is where Sim2Real is starting to work actually pretty well. I think the other aspect, which means how much we can really trust it to have the same kind of failure modes and things like that that the real world has, I would still be careful. Also because in the real world we often have deformable fingers and hands and objects, and those often turn out to be actually easier than the rigid kind of object that we're using in simulation often. I know there's also various simulators out there that do now starting to do high-speed deformable surfaces and objects. So there's clearly some promise in that domain. But for benchmarking, I would say, so don't get me wrong, you can benchmark algorithms, right? Like the typical one policy against another policy. But for benchmarking in the sense of that it transfers the benchmarking insights immediately would transfer to the real world, I would say maybe, but I wouldn't quite go there and say, yeah, we're there and we should do this already, right? And it's working. And then finally, of course, there's all these other domains, like, for example, with granular media and with deformable objects, where it's about kind of predicting deformation fields and stress on objects and stuff like that. So I think in those domains, we can say that we've done some work, for example, where you can adjust the simulation parameters based on real world experience. So I would say overall that we see some pretty good evidence for Sim2Real, especially also when you look at deformable, like ropes and stuff like that. You've also seen very cool examples of robots interacting with ropes and doing things with ropes. So we're seeing some, again, pretty good evidence for Sim2Real, but I wouldn't say it's out there, right? Just because we don't have maybe enough suitable assets, or we don't even know exactly what the appropriate task is that we should benchmark in this domain. And with respect to transferring those insights from those benchmarks immediately to the real world, I think we still have quite a way to go, actually. So with that, I want to kind of summarize on the benchmarking side. So I think on the one hand side, of course, simulation is a very promising approach for benchmarking, also for real world. I think it's important to, even in simulation, not just think about benchmarking one sim algorithm against another sim algorithm, but we want to benchmark so that the insights we gain transfer to the real world, right? And for that, I think this notion of, for example, Sim2Real or so is just not sufficient, because you can do many tricks to make something work from Sim2Real, but those same tricks might not really reflect the real world, right? But if you want to benchmark things, then you need to take that into account, and that is this notion, what I might call this not sim to not real. I think we could do and should be able to do benchmarking for things like obstacle-free, collision-free motion generation, rigid object grasping and rearrangement, also in articulated scenes. So I think in those domains, that's clearly something where we should be able to even benchmark systems ultimately that were trained in the real world. And I think that would be a big plus for the community, right? Because then you can really go back and say, okay, how well is that algorithm actually working compared to another algorithm, right? Because again, we're seeing many of these examples where people develop their own little benchmark that holds for one paper, but it's hard to see progress really over longer periods of time. Important, of course, for all this benchmarking is that they must have enough variety of the assets and environments and things like that. And it's also important that it's not just a passive kind of data set, but that you can do the simulation in the loop for the testing of your algorithm. Yeah, it would be nice if there was something like a certificate so that you can say, okay, that benchmark, it's going to transfer, right, to the real world. And I think I don't. I could also talk about something else here, but broader, what we can talk about that in the panel too. So thank you.
Any questions?
Thank you. So I think I would add system identification to your list. Because in one way, benchmark is similar to something you have a model. Obviously, your model is wrong, but can you identify the role of your model or simulator actually behaves as the role? And the answer is no, then obviously your simulator is not. And the answer is yes, that you should do system ID more often, which applies to everyone in this group.
No,
Yeah.
I totally agree. And also, like low-level control of these manipulations, like really the thing to read is not as easy as you might think. Right? And yeah, so.
If you industry, right, I think they are also using a lot of grippers to make many of the tasks simpler. And I'm noticing that, like some of these benchmarks, they're only focused on the two fingers gripper. Whereas for some of the objects for grasping and other kinds of tasks, the gripper makes a big difference. So do you have any thoughts on that? Like, because at one level, ultimately the gripper is important, right?
Yeah, that's a great point. I think actually that's a plus of the simulation side because you can model different grippers, right? And you would hope that, for example, like these blast data set or these benchmarks, that you can benchmark specific grippers, right? So the different kinds of algorithm, you might develop an algorithm that works for any gripper, and then you should randomize over the gripper, but you should also be able to say, that gripper, how well can I solve that task? And I think at least for rigid grippers, we should be able to do that reasonably well. Another aspect, of course, is suction cups, right? Really important in industry. And I think Ken Goldberg's team, with the DEXNet, they came up with a model for suction cup. As far as I know, there's still no really good physics first simulation for suction cup. So, for example, what I hear from industry, what they want to do, imagine your warehouse, right? And you want to, with your suction cup, pick up all these different objects. And then if you want to simulate how does it work on a plastic bag and stuff like that, actually the simulation of that is very, very complicated. And I think we're not quite there. We can use suction cup simulation for kind of rigid objects. I think those models work, is my understanding, pretty well, but for arbitrary objects, we're not there. And I could be wrong. There's other people who are much deeper understanding of simulation. Yeah.
And where would you put highly dynamic tasks in your classification of feasibility?
Yeah. So lowly dynamic is the in-hand orientation, right? And they are very cautious in the sense of saying, like, we're not quite there, right? Which means, again, sim to real might work, but I don't think we have quite the realism so that you could just benchmark large scale settings, right? So like throwing things likely because it's, but the more complex, let's say, highly dynamic interactive tasks with physics, and everything is, I would say, I don't think that we are at the level where we can really benchmark them, and all these benchmarks are going to just reflect the real world well. But I would also pose that question to the panel because there's other people.
Yeah. So my question is, don't you think benchmarking is hard because robots keep on changing the tasks keep on changing. So how do you ensure uniformity across the world?
Yeah, that's a great point. I actually think this. Wait, I couldn't even. Oh no, it's gone. I actually had a slide related to that. Where, on the one hand, on the one hand, I think maybe we can agree on a certain set of tasks that we believe are kind of fundamental and that are worth benchmarking, like object rearrangement, right? That grasping, pushing, moving things around and opening and closing things in environment. I think those would be tests that, first of all, we can benchmark and maybe we can agree upon that. These are important enough tasks that it's worth doing so. Um, and then at the same time, of course, we need to work on things like as we see nowadays with all the VLM, vision language models, LLMs, that there's great work going on. That at this point is really hard to benchmark.
Don't every have don't
Oh, and then robots, and I mean that's actually why I'm trying to advocate for using simulation for benchmarking, because the hope would be that you can just plug and play the robots in there and you can do that. And that's exactly why benchmarking in the real world is so hard. Right? Anything robot. So it would be good to do some robot, so contribute to what is robot without having.
Okay, thank you. The data start of